Your absolutes define your future. Those things that are non-negotiable, that should be fundamental to us, if we understand them, they will create the roadmap forward to your future, to your destiny, if you want to call it that. And so today we're going to look at what that means and why it is so important and something we rarely talk about. What is God's will? What's God's will in this situation? Which way do I turn? What should I do? This is a question every believer has asked, generally more than once. It's one of those questions that goes with us through life. What's God's will? We see so often so many options, so many decisions to be made, or faced with uncertainty. What do we do? And so what we're looking at today is how understanding our absolutes, our priorities that are non-negotiable, they actually don't constrain us, but they create freedom. And we're going to look specifically today in a very real situation, a good friend who was faced with a myriad of choices that were pulling her in many directions. Now, out of respect for privacy, we won't use any names, but the principle applies whether it's a myriad of choices or facing uncertainty. Understanding our absolutes helps us see more clearly what is God's will in their situation. Knowing our absolutes helps create and provide a roadmap showing us the way forward into what God has for us. And in fact, what it does is it shows us that when the right decision seems to be the most difficult, it may seem to be the decision that doesn't have the opportunity, the blessing attached to it. And we'll see what I mean in a moment. Now, we are going to look at a very specific situation, a very specific person. Now, in her case, she's very talented, she loves the Lord, and she was being presented. All these choices were coming at her from different directions. Now, here's the good news. So many of these decisions were mutually exclusive. In other words, an example, one of them was to leave Madrid and go to another city for a position that seemed rather prestigious. So what happens, it automatically created that, well, if I make this decision, then I can't do those. In other words, there was good news in this. She couldn't become overwhelmed and bogged down by saying yes to too many things because some of them were so, again, mutually exclusive that it was this, and if you do this, you can't do that. And that was good because it forced her in a position to not just automatically accept something that might seem to be a blessing, but rather she was able to recognize this decision is bigger than it appears initially. Now I'm going to give you one very specific instance. One thing was, again, she lives in Madrid, very active in a local church, real contributor of her gifts and talents, a real support for her local pastor. But one of the opportunities which would appear with a university further north in the country would take her away from that. And that was really enticing. It seemed to be a real promotion. Now, in the course of conversation, we took a step back. Rather than trying to evaluate the opportunities, we took a step back and okay, let's set the opportunities aside. Let's talk about priorities. What are those absolutes? What are the commitments that are important in your life? Now, I'm going to focus just on one. But one of her primary commitments was to support her pastor, to help and support her local church. Now, here's the good news. See, when she really understood, not that she didn't, but when really she focused on, hang on, what is my real commitment here? All of a sudden, that decision, that other opportunity that might appear to be so enticing that to say no would feel like a letdown. What happened? When she really got a hold of what her priorities were, she came to the realization, that's appealing, but it's a real distraction. It will take me away from what's most important. So what happens? Understanding our absolutes, whether it's in the case of, as in this situation, multiple options, or even more importantly, in the face of uncertainty, understanding what commitments are so important to us, it helps filter out so much of the indecision. Now, and I mentioned something earlier. See, one of the things that happens is, so often, it's what I call the hidden blessing. The hidden blessing is that thing that God has for you, but it's not obvious. And while this over here may seem so much more enticing, and what happens? That voice in our head starts to say, maybe this is God. Maybe this is a door God's opening, and wow, what could come from this? We're now distracted. Now, if that is what God has, fantastic. Praise God. This is going to be cool. It's a whole new adventure. But so often we can miss out on the hidden blessing. Why? Because that thing that seems enticing, seems appealing, is frankly just a distraction. And staying where we are, focusing on something that doesn't seem to have as much opportunity in it, being committed to something that maybe doesn't seem to have the same blessing. What happens? A door opens later because of our faithfulness. God honors that faithfulness, and He brings a blessing that we couldn't have created. So why am I talking about this? We live in a time of increasing uncertainty. And it's important for all of us to take that time to go back, and this is not an extensive list, your real true commitments, those true absolutes, it's a short list. But once we really bring that to the forefront, when we acknowledge and commit to these are my absolutes, what happens? Many of the uncertainties, many of the distractions, many of the options and choices literally fade away. Why? They don't line up with that roadmap of commitment, that roadmap of absolutes that God has put in our heart. See, we miss our future, we miss our destiny, not because we purposely are ignoring what the Lord is saying, but because we don't see, because we have taken our eyes off of those absolutes, and we're enticed away by things that seem like maybe this is God. So my challenge is, I want to encourage you, take this time. What are the absolutes in your life? What are the things that you have committed to, you laid hold of, you grabbed a hold of, and you don't want to, you're not willing to change. You're not willing to adapt. And that's a good thing in this case. Why? Because God will honor when we know our absolutes. And again, in this case, one of her fundamental absolutes was support for her pastor and her local church. What happened? That eliminated so many other opportunities, eliminated so much uncertainty. And as I said a moment ago, we live in an era when uncertainty is becoming more and more the norm. And there can feel this pressure that we need to respond somehow. And my hope is that you take the time to really determine your absolutes, that'll create that security that as we remain committed to those absolutes, that God will honor that and He will provide the blessing.